I'm just glad you're here tonight with us.
I'm happy to be here.
I was going to do your introduction of your bio, and then I'm just going to turn it over to you for the evening.
Okay.
So Jack is the author of several collections of essays that explore the human and natural history of the Intermountain West, including Ancient Places and Visible Bones. He has also written award-winning biographies of fur agent David Thompson, which I have that book, and it's an excellent book, and naturalist David Douglas. Jack's latest book, The Dreamer and the Doctor, tracks John and Carrie Leiberg, am I saying their names correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Through our region and beyond. And Jack even has a website at www.jacknisbet.com. And I checked that out earlier, and it has his publications on there. So please go visit that site and enjoy our presentation.
Okay, great. I'm going to put it up and I'm ready to go whenever you are.
Okay. We are ready to go.
Okay, good deal. So thank you for inviting me again. I'm really happy to come share this story of this couple, John and Carrie Leiberg. They are astonishing people who were all over Idaho in the 1880s and 90s and into the 20th century a little bit. And their story is really twisted and it goes all over the place, but it's all based around plants. And I love that because plants are what got me into a lot of the writing that I do. And it's a very simple story of its time in a lot of ways because the railroad is everything. The Northern Pacific completes their route from Minnesota to Tacoma in 1883, and John Leiberg has a job with them. He's a Swedish immigrant. He's came over by himself as a teenager, ended up in Iowa in a Swedish community there, married another Swedish immigrant and had a couple kids, seemed to have a together family, was a member, upstanding member of the community. Then all of a sudden he's in Mankato, Minnesota, and he's working for the railroad and they use his knowledge of plants. He's been into plants the whole time. And his job is a great one. As soon as they finished the tracks, the Northern Pacific started putting out these posters that describe the West as this Eden where you could go make it and trying to attract people to ride the train. And he went out and planted box elders along the train tracks so that people would think Western North Dakota and Eastern Montana were a deciduous forest, as you can see from these lovely pictures. And that mining in Idaho would be like a carnival ride, as you can see from the one on the lower left. It'll be great. And he ends up doing all that in the summer of 1883, but he also makes it all the way to Mount Rainier. And the reason we know that is he collects specimens. There's 10,000, 12,000 of them in the Smithsonian collection. There's another 10,000 in the University of Oregon. He was a mad collector, really good at pressing plants, was way into mosses and liverworts and lichens and fungi as well. And he collects this wallflower from Mount Rainier in the summer of 1883. So you think, this is going to be great, you know, and he's immediately attracted to Idaho as he goes from the bend from Missoula down to Spokane and then cross on the north edge of Lake Pend Oreille. Like many of the passengers at that time, he's attracted to the beauty of it and also the gold strikes that were happening right then around Pritchard in the Coeur d'Alene country. But yet at the same time, there's always more with Leiberg's story. And he goes back to Minneapolis and does a presentation to the Minnesota Natural History Society about fossils in Western North Dakota and describes ginkgo leaf fossils that he found there in what is now Teddy Roosevelt National Park. And comments on how ironic it is there's all these hardscrabble farmers out there going broke, trying to grow deciduous plants, and they're having to clear all these fossil leaves of deciduous plants out in order to try to farm. And he's aware of the irony of this. He's aware of the climate, and he ponders the geologic change that dried up the prairies. He's collecting flowers and thinking about them in a real ecological way. He's just really a pleasure to read his letters and reports, because he takes such a broad view of everything. He has these great quotes later on. Nobody can understand botany without a solid knowledge of geology first, because it's the rocks and the soils that create the habitats for the plants. This is a way before a lot of other people are doing it. And as far as we can tell, this guy never went to school after he was 15. He grew up in Malmo in Sweden. And he's got a really interesting way of thinking about the landscape and being on it. Here's a shot of Lake Pend Oreille looking to the south shore. The town of Bayview is on the right, and Cape Horn. On the left is Bernard Peak. And this is where John homesteaded when he came back. That flat part in the middle is Farragut State Park today, but that's the old Leiberg homestead. And he did not bring his wife and kids from Iowa. He brought a new woman with him named Carrie Marvin and an infant child. So there's all kinds of things to read into that, but we don't know very much about it. What we do know is that he had really thought about the country. He came back in 1884 after his first trip out and went to Lewiston on a steamboat, bought a horse, and rode up through what is now the Nez Perce Reservation into the Clearwater country, and describes the forest, describes the tribe managing their reservation with fire, goes over the divide and into the St. Joe drainage, and describes torn up forests, careless fires that the miners are setting, people trying to homestead and going broke, and again, not paying attention to where they are and kind of messing things up. But he also finds a lot of big cedar groves and big, beautiful white pine stands that still exist there to some much smaller extent. And he really likes it. And he's collecting plants again, so that when he comes back with Carrie, he has something to go on. Carrie Marvin is a woman who was from Mankato. She had married a much older man on the agreement that he would send her to medical school. She attended the Women's Medical College of Chicago, which is now part of Northwestern University. And she graduated in 1882. This newspaper article is right over her name, Carrie from Mankato. And there's a headline in the Chicago paper talking about how all these lady doctors are graduating. It's not a time when there were many lady doctors, but they're starting to come on. The headline talks about the value of cleanliness, and the graduation speech talked about washing up. And you could think that they were just being trained to be nurses in empty bedpans, but that's far from the case. We have her textbooks and know the courses she took, and she was trained in gynecology, pediatrics, surgery, and histology, which is the study of how you mount specimens on slides. And that will play large in their story as we go along. And she probably had one of these student microscopes with a crouch stand that was kind of the standard of the time. That's a really good microscope that is not a toy by any means. So Carrie and John show up on the Pend Oreille, build this little cabin in 1885. They have the child was born in 1884, so he's 1 year old. And they go about their business, getting chickens and cows and clearing land and doing the things that homesteaders do. But in Idaho at this time, everybody is thinking about mining. So John develops this trail that goes from Athol up into the little North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River, which is a very isolated drainage that was not on any map at the time. And that Athol Leiberg Road remains on the Forest Service maps until after World War II. And he and Carrie staked about 24 claims, 30 claims in the Little North Fork over the next 10 years. Never made a whole bunch of money, but made some money. And the idea was you sell them off to a larger mining concern at some point. And he's always talking about rocks and always thinking about how he can make his fortune at mining, even though his real love is collecting plants. So you get this amazing back and forth where he's writing letters back east saying, hey, I got all these Idaho gold thread, these endemics that you won't be able to get anywhere else and there's plenty of calypsos out here. He's writing to herbariums that are building up their collection, don't have much from North Idaho, and he's going to supply them. It's a money-making operation. And he finds a little water lily in a little pond left over from the glacial floods of Lake Missoula and realizes that it is not described, sends it in to the Botanical Gazette. There's an academic there who's interested in it and describes it and names it after him. It is still named after him. Today it's called Leiberg's pygmy water lily. And it's a beautiful plant that is today not seen hasn't been seen in Idaho for years, but is known from Minnesota all the way to Maine. So it's one of these mystery plants that we know it's there from Leiberg's specimen, which again is the type specimens in the Smithsonian collected by him just behind the railroad station at Granite, Idaho. It's great stuff. And it's what he wants to do. He's mad to do it. And his letters attract other collectors out to North Idaho. One of them is named John Sandberg from Minneapolis. He's a physician, as many of these naturalists are. He might have known Leiberg before, but he comes out in 1887 and Leiberg takes him up into the Coeur d'Alenes and shows him these beautiful biscuit roots that follow the snow line up to the timberline. And Leiberg is really getting interested in the umbellifera family, and because they're so abundant from the mountains down into the shrub steppe. So he shows this one to Sandberg. Sandberg takes it back and gets it named after himself, which I don't know what Leiberg thought of that, but it's still a beautiful plant that is, to those of us who climb mountains in North Idaho, is, it's the sign of spring. It's following the snowback as you go up. And is a really terrific endemic cultural plant that grizzly bears have been seen digging up for the bulbs, and it makes you think of all these tribal people who are using this whole suite of biscuit roots all over the Columbia and Snake River basins. Eventually, or actually soon, all his letters and specimens find their way back to Elizabeth Knight Britton, who is this force, an amazing person back east, who is starting to develop what becomes the New York Botanic Garden, was the Torrey Botanical Club at that time. Her husband is a geology professor at Columbia University. She is well-trained. Her dad ran a sugar plantation in Cuba. She's multilingual. She's a bryologist for the most part, studying mosses and liverworts, but she's very conversant about everything. She publishes over 300 papers in her time. She's the first editor, as far as we can tell, of a scientific journal, a first female editor of a scientific journal in America. And she's interested in Leiberg because he wants to make his mark in botany, and he realizes that nobody has looked at the mosses in North Idaho. And Britton is all about that. She understands what he's doing, and they start sending things back and forth. She'll send him specimens from her collections from Europe and back east to compare to what he's finding out there. They name new species and they get things together. And Leiberg sends these wonderful letters. She'll send him 2 or 3 letters a week. I mean, once the train happened, communication is very fluid between New York City and Hope, Idaho. But Leiberg will sit down and write a 20-page letter to her and then go off prospecting. And so he won't write as often, but these letters are so charming. This is one that has a picture of a granite shelf that has been carved by the Ice Age floods, and he finds a beautiful Alsatian moss under it. And this says, it grew like this, hanging in long, soft festoons from the underside of the shelving rock. That's just one little page, one little sentence out of 20 pages. But he did so much more than that. And most of their letters are this conversations about the moss's identification and descriptions. And within 2 years, Britain has a paper describing 90 mosses that Leiberg has collected in North Idaho. She's the author. She credits him as the collector. She is a terrific scientific illustrator, as you can see from, this is the leading page of it. It's just amazing. These are things she drew from her microscope. And now, you know, we have electron microscopes and can look at peristomes and think, wow, this is beautiful stuff. But they have really good microscopes, and Leiberg is sitting in his little cabin with a growing baby, and Carrie is trying to be a doctor and, you know, trying to take care of all their critters, and still cranking out papers and descriptions and arguing with Britain about the parts of the mosses they're trying to describe. But he also says other things, because again, his mind is never limited to plants. He's got an amazing ability to focus on them, but he does all these other things. This is a painting by the Jesuit priest Nicholas Point, done on Lake Coeur d'Alene in 1842, of a Coeur d'Alene driving deer down into the lake so they can kill them, and using fire. To Point, this is really what it is saying is Nicholas Point is terrified of fire, and becomes a very chaotic scene. Leiberg describes Kalispel people living in a well-known winter village right next to his homestead, doing drives down off Cape Horn into Lake Pend Oreille to kill deer. So it's half a century later, and the Salish-speaking peoples are still operating as they did, even though their world is changing very fast and very entirely. They're still sticking to it. Leiberg calls his neighbors barbarians for doing this because he thinks it's hard on the deer. But it's this kind of awareness and this setting around him that begins to lead to his appreciation for the cultural practices of the Kalispel and other tribes, plateau tribes, especially in relation to plants. Carrie, meanwhile, is a doctor. And even though she's trying to run this homestead while John's gone prospecting, she's also a professional. So she goes into Post Falls. There's a new railroad spur to Post Falls. It's not that many miles south from their homestead. She opens an office. There's a big logging boom going on. There's big mining boom just beginning in the Silver Valley. There's a military fort there. There's people that need a doctor. So she takes their little son, whose name is Bernard, and she opens an office. He's 5 years old this year. And he immediately gets scarlet fever, and they have to go. She goes and rents a cabin on the outskirts of town, papers up all the windows because it's the middle of winter and it's freezing, gets one of the bellboys from the local hotel to bring food and put it at their door. It's just disturbingly familiar. And she writes back to Britain to describe this. If she didn't start writing to Elizabeth Britton, we wouldn't know anything about Carrie Leiberg. But Elizabeth Britton also can think of other things besides plants. And she had started sending Carrie some magazine articles and newspapers just because she knew Carrie was thirsting for knowledge of the outside world. And they became what I would call friends. And the letters that Carrie writes to Elizabeth Britton are where we find out what's going on. And it's pretty interesting. Bernard gets over the scarlet fever, and there comes an early little brush of spring, as still happens in the Coeur d'Alene country around the lake. And she finds some buttercups and writes to Britton, I found several buttercups this morning, the first I have seen this season. I was quite surprised to find that little Bernard remembered the names petals, stamens, etc., and applied them all correctly. So again, Bernard is 5. He remembers plant parts and names of plants from the previous year. So now we're starting to find that Bernard is part of this story and that plants are the way he gets brought in as well. Now, Bernard is about to start school. Hope on the north end of Lake Pend Oreille has just been declared as a section station by the Northern Pacific Railroad. So it's going to grow in population and they're going to build a school there. So in 1891, Carrie moves her office up to Hope, gets a stamp so she can have stationery stamp, a beautiful purple stamp as everybody should have, and keeps writing to Elizabeth Britton. And she practices in a very difficult situation. It's not easy being a doctor, but she has patients, many of whom are women who are desperately poor. Their husbands are gone all the time. They're drinking away the paycheck. They are beating them. They're having a child every year. Many of them die. Her letters are very disturbing as to what she has to see to be a doctor there. But it's part of what the medical world was then, I guess you could say. The office that she opens up is just across the train tracks from David Thompson's fur trade post that he called Cullyspell House, that was the first building in Idaho. And there's still a tribal encampment that happens there every fall. That was the reason Thompson built the trade house there. There's beautiful petroglyphs there that are part of that whole tribal scene. And that just seems to be part of it. There's a lot of balls in the air with the Leibergs. And Bernard becomes one of them, as you can see. Elizabeth Britton writes to Carrie and says, gosh, let me send a artist pad to Bernard for a present so that he can draw while you're doing all this work. And Carrie writes back to Elizabeth, thank you for your wish to send something to please my son Bernard. He has no tracing slate, nor, so far as I can discover, the least talent for drawing. His whole soul is wrapped up in engines, railroad trains, steamboats, etc. He is alternately a brakeman, engineer, steam valve, and whistle, and the racket he keeps up is astonishing and half maddening. The chairs are all arranged in a line with a pail, box, or basket on the first one for a smokestack. Then the wood box will be emptied and its contents deranged along the floor for a railroad track, and so on, day after day, in endless variations of the same theme. He is so full of vitality that keeping still is entirely out of the question with him, and my only hope is to direct it in normal channels. I think that dominoes would please him, for he could imagine them as cars and have himself a new sort of train. So if you're reading these letters and have ever been alone with a kid in the winter in the Northwest in the woods, or read about the modern way that people look at the line of succession of autism and how they see it working and what kids do that get obsessed with things and how that looks in the long run. All kinds of red flags come out of her letter like this. But that's not the world that Carrie lives in. She lives in a world where you raise your kids as best you can and go on with your business. And the fact that, the fact that Bernard is a handful and remains so and lives with Carrie until she dies 50 years later is really, that's just beside the point. What we're trying to do right now is just take care of business. And Carrie's business is being a doctor, and that is also so hard. And she writes some amazing things to Britton about that. Again, her main focus is on childbirth at this point, and she has a couple pairs of forceps in her bag, including these long forceps of that time, and writes to Britton, unfortunately, I have a very uncomfortable disposition regarding my patients, and a bad case worries me greatly. I have one on hand right now, peripheral peritonitis, seen for the first time last night, the worry of which will effectively prevent any rest for me this evening. The study of medicine is grand, but the practice is so full of responsibility and labor that it is very, very hard. It is a terrible thing to see a little brood of children who within a few hours may find themselves motherless. Even the best of physicians are so powerless. It is no wonder that one with either knowledge or conscience dreads the responsibility. Now, I've read a lot of doctors write, a lot of male doctors used to write, and I've read doctors writing all my life, like people like Anton Chekhov and William Carlos Williams. And it is astonishing the way that there's lines that they write that sound exactly like this. How the powerlessness of physicians, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century. But I just read a book by a British brain surgeon that sounds just like this. I mean, if he makes a mistake, terrible things can still happen. And if you have a conscience, that can bother you. And Carrie is bothered by this. Well, again, today we might say she has depression after a difficult case, but that's not the world she lived in. She's a doctor. She takes her patients as they come and she does what she can. And the way that she can heal them, again, she has a limited kit, but it's all built around plants. When she is trying to induce labor or help a difficult labor, she has ergot that's a fungus. When she has somebody in terrible pain, they're drinking opium and laudanum from poppies, and she's dosing it out. When somebody is weak, and this happens several times, and she mentions more than once that her favorite dispenser is Horlicks malted milk, which again is barley, and she builds back strength in patients that appear to be close to death, especially women who are in a long labor or have just given a difficult birth, or who are bleeding out after an abortion that they went and got in Spokane. It is hair-raising, but amazing to think that this is all tribal. The tribes have this whole medicinal world built, and what Carrie did was not that much different. It's amazing the changes that have happened since then, but she did what she could with what she had. That's all she could do. So that goes on in Hope. Carrie keeps her office. John goes back and forth to the homestead. Carrie goes back and forth to the homestead when she can. Bernard takes in a few early years of school, and he visited Hope in the 1930s when he was a grown man. And there was a newspaper article about him where they interviewed some of his old classmates. And a couple of them remembered how even when he was in the first and second grade, he knew the names of all the local plants in Latin. Again, he had that kind of obsessive memory listing gene that many naturalists and botanists that I know have, and I love them for it. And some of them get it really early. Some of them get into it when they're kids, and they are just amazing at how their knowledge grows as time goes on. And Bernard was somehow one of those people. But there was this huge economic depression in 1893, the Panic of 1893, brought on in large part by a collapse in the silver price that was coming out of, a lot of which was coming out of the Silver Valley. John realized that prospecting might not be the best thing for him to be doing. And through his connections with Elizabeth Britton, he got a job with the USDA doing a plant survey in Eastern Washington of the Columbia Basin. Again, he's a seasonal for the Forest Service, think of it that way. And his job is to go from Spokane to the Cascades, to Stevens Pass. And there's all these things they didn't know. They didn't know where trees grew. They didn't know the extent of the sagebrush. They knew nothing about the Cascade volcanoes. They didn't know what the east slope of the Cascade had for plants. And his job is to try to figure a lot of that out, especially in regards to the dry country, to see whether anybody might be able to make a living farming there. There's farmers coming in, and a lot of them aren't making it. Dr. Sandberg from Minnesota comes out to be the head botanist on this expedition. John is in charge of wrangling the horses and keeping camp and doing most of the collections. And it turns out he ended up doing almost everything because Sandberg had a bum leg. And John's the guy that's out. And he kept a journal from this summer that really gives you a picture of how cool he is. He's the one that's going out every day. He likes to talk. He talks to all the farmers and ranchers that he sees. He's tracking barbed wire. He's tracking new train tracks. He's tracking weather and crops and everything. It's a real look at what the Columbia Basin was at that time. And he ends up going to Stevens Pass and then climbing Mount Stewart at the end of the summer, just because he wants to do everything. And it's really the first ecological description of Eastern Washington that we have. It's really an important document, this journal is. And he has a plant list that goes with it that you can compare to any plant list now and really learn a lot. Just introduce plants, weeds. There's plenty of them coming in. And it's just fascinating to see what's there then against what's there now. So it's really when he comes into flower and he realizes this is what he wants to do, and he develops a great relationship with the man who became the first director of the US Herbarium, Frederick Coville, who's a pretty big name in botany. And they go back and forth doing a lot of really interesting stuff. Coville never hires Sandberg again. He hires Leiberg every summer he can get him from then on, and gives him money to come to Washington, D.C. in the winter to trace out his collections. Carrie, meanwhile, has bought a camera, and Elizabeth Britton had bought one, and they talk about what kind to get Carrie and all this stuff. And Carrie, she goes down to Indian Meadows, which is, again, where David Thompson came in 1809 and built his trade house, and takes the only photographs we know of the tribal encampment there. It lasted till 1956 when Albany Falls Dam closed, but these are from the 1890s. They're probably taken by Carrie. And again, it's about plants. Here is a child whose name we know, running behind her dad, whose name we know from Kalispell people. And she's clearly carrying 2 sticks of Indian hemp, Spetson, that they come to the Clark Fork Delta to collect every fall. It's the main cordage plant for any plateau tribe. So all of a sudden we're deep into cultural plants, and Carrie has the sense to take the picture that shows that. John takes plenty of pictures of woods and trees and plants from after he gets a camera in a couple of years, but he never gets anything cultural like this. Here's a photograph that shows the buggy that they came from Cusick or Flathead Lake or the Bitterroot, wherever they came from, on the left. Then every together family has 3 racks. This is what Kalispell elders told me all through the 80s, 90s. Oh yeah, you had to have 3 racks, 1 for meat, 1 for fish, and 1 for hides whenever you came there. And here's a woman out there doing a ton of work, drying whitefish, picking Indian hemp, getting her toolies. There's all these things to do while you're there. They would stay there for weeks while the men were up doing deer drives, or there's a million things to do when you're at Indian Meadows. The fact that the trees in the background might be red alders and are a disjunct from coastal timber counts, that's another way to look at this picture, and another reason to thank Carrie Leiberg. So in the fall of 1893, John goes to Washington, D.C. to work up his collections at the Smithsonian. Carrie is left to, Carrie gets a job with the Northern Pacific as a surgeon, the only woman railroad surgeon in the United States. And she now takes care of people who are signing on, does their physicals if they're signing on to work for the railroad. When somebody gets their leg cut off by a boxcar, she's the one that has to sew it up, and it's like being in a war. Then when one of the railroad workers' wives gets into trouble, gets into a difficult labor, on Christmas Eve in this year of 1893, she goes out in a rainstorm with one of them and pumps a pump car 10 miles down the track to go try to save this baby, which she can't do, but she does save the mother. So Carrie's still hard at it. John is doing all kinds of stuff, and it's very successful at it. Carrie continues to work as a railroad surgeon for the Northern Pacific. In 1894, Coville hires Leiberg to look at the Eastern Oregon desert and see what it's like. Nobody's ever been there, really looking at plants. John gets across the border and immediately finds John Day biscuit root, this beautiful Lomachium. That's a cultural plant that blooms really early. He has realized that you have to get off really early to catch these biscuit roots as they're blooming so that you can see the true diversity of the place. He runs into Umatilla tribal women gathering cows and watches them make these big cakes out of the roots that are exactly what Lewis and Clark watched people make when they came across a century earlier. And just as Patrick Gass did for Lewis and Clark, Leiberg realizes that they are not just gathering cows, they're gathering a whole multitude of species of biscuit roots and messing with the taste and the preparation. And each family has their own recipes and really making something interesting and complicated out of these roots that they're gathering. And he keeps sending different biscuit root, different Lomachiums back east. There's a specialist there working for Coville who is taxonomizing them and making up, getting new species all the time. And again, the type specimens are still in the Smithsonian. You can see them. It's a very successful trip. The next year, Coville hires him to go and survey all the waters that drain into Lake Coeur d'Alene, which is a very complex set of rivers that include the St. Mary's, the St. Joe, and the Coeur d'Alene rivers. And he knows this country real well. He does a farm wagon and goes around. He starts really early, goes from Rathdrum down to the south end of Lake Coeur d'Alene. And as he's crossing the state line into Idaho, he finds another new Lomachium that he thinks is a new biscuit root. He sends it back. They taxonomize it and make it into Atausha for about a century. And now in the most recent Hitchcock is back being a Lomachium. And it's still growing. It hasn't been seen in the area where Leiberg collected it for a couple of years, but it's now it turns out it's abundant down at Weite Prairie where the camas are. So you can kind of trace these plants moving around in the culture just like you can trace people and moving around. They become just as important as Leiberg thought they were. He also sees a lot of devastation. Again, he's traveling in a lot of the country that he saw in 1884. It's a decade later, and he just very discouraged by how decimated a lot of the country is. This is a photograph taken by the Northern Pacific only a year before Leiberg went out. And the sparks from the steam engines obviously torched anything near the track, and they went a lot further. The miners weren't very careful with a lot of their doings, and it was very thickly timbered country, so they would burn off outcrops just so they could see the rocks. And then there would be avalanches the next year. There'd be a lot. What Leiberg does that is really showing how smart he is he's realizing that it's going to be hard to recover from this kind of devastation, that you're going to get dog hair, Douglas fir, and lodgepole pine coming back from devastating fires and tough avalanches. And it's going to just get into a cycle that we actually are living in now, where it's hard to beat the wildfires and the dog hair coming back. He also sees the Silver Valley mining boom and sees how they have messed with the water quality and realizes that that's going to be a problem going forward for centuries. And he makes no bones about it. He writes a very long report. He centers it around the timber industry and the mining industry, and also has a great plant list from this trip that you can compare then to now. He goes back to Eastern Oregon in 1896, going all the way to Payette, Idaho, and dabbling around in the Boise Basin a little bit, and then going up the Malheur River and coming across southern Oregon and California and Nevada, dipping in to get to Crater Lake. Another amazing trip. But then the following year is what he's really most remembered for, is he begins a series of forest reserve timber surveys The forest reserves have been created by a series of acts by Congress, and they're going to turn into the Forest Service that we know under Teddy Roosevelt. And this is the in-between time. Somebody had to survey and then catalog all these areas so they knew what they had. And Leiberg's first assignment is Priest Lake, because the Priest River Reserve, because of all the valuable white pine and tamarack that's in there. And they send surveyors out in front of him, and he walks the ridges and figures out that the boundary should be extended this way or that for what becomes the national forest. It's quite an interesting document. He has a camera with him, and he has his plant list. With the camera, he still has to harp on the carelessness of the fires. Here's a road supervisor that's burning slash and is getting into good white pine timber. He hates the waste. He wants the resources to be used wisely. But at the same time, he's into these endemic plants. Leiberg is very aware of the botanical history of the Northwest. He knows all about David Douglas and how David Douglas watched the Chinook people eat bog cranberries and harvest them. Then he gets into Priest Lake on the west side of the lake in these rich old beaver bogs and sees bog cranberries there and realizes, wow, it's quite a disjunct to the heart of their range. This is strange. Then he sees red flowery currant, which you can still see at the experimental forest at Priest Lake, which is definitely a coastal plant for him. And he gets really interested in plant ranges and the ecology and long-term geology and change and climate change of how that might have worked. He's thinking about glaciers. He's thinking about time, deep time. It's great stuff. And his plant lists these plant lists that he has are so amazing to look at. They're all at the Smithsonian. So for the latter half of 1897 and all of 1898, he does the Bitterroot Forest Reserve, which was the biggest one in the West. It included what is now the Clearwater and the Bitterroot, so it's gigantic. Most of it is in Idaho, some of it is in Montana, and he approaches it through the three passes that are well known today: Lolo Pass, Lost Horse Pass, and Nez Perce Pass, and comes up from the Bitterroot side and down into the Idaho part, exploring. And he's just in heaven. This is really his favorite, becomes his favorite place, just trying to figure out the convoluted structure of how the mountains and the drainages work. He has wonderful writing about how confusing it is. He's all into, and Frederick Coville is all into comparing his plant list with Lewis and Clark's plant list from the century before. And he begins to understand, first of all, why they had such a tough time coming down off Lolo, but then why the tribes use it so efficiently and how magic it is. And he's really devastated by the way that Jippo prospectors like himself are not careful in going in and setting fires to look for prospects. Now he is working for the USGS. They're the ones that had charge of these forest reserves. So he gets their map making ability. And he goes back to DC in the winter and makes a series of maps that are just astonishing for his report, that have each species of tree, the range of each species of tree just laid into it. So you can really see something special like alpine larch, which has a real limited range, where it grows in the Bitterroot and the Clearwater. And he just, again, you can use, these are the baseline documents. If you're going to be a forester today in this region or in the Panhandle forest, this is how you have to start. You know, if you want to think about the long-term health and structure of the forest. He had a camera with him. He took a tripod with glass plates and took pictures of these astonishing, yellow pine. This is a tribal forest managed by fire for some hundreds of years that creates these beautiful centuries-old ponderosas. And by the time Leiberg's there, they're starting to get cut. And Hamilton is a big timber center. But his goal and the goal of the Forest Service was to take the resource efficiently and sustainably. He writes a lot about how can we do this so it sustains, the resource is sustained over a long period of time. He also takes pictures of how the fires work their way. This is a Douglas fir draw that is all burned in the West Fork. And there's been a lot of really interesting fire studies since then that describe seasons and describe which ones are cultural fires and which ones are lightning strikes, et cetera. And again, these photographs are a way to look into that. He finds more of the disjunct shrubs and flowers that we love, Pacific dogwood in the Selway, for instance, which is mind-boggling to anybody who thinks about Pacific dogwood, but is still growing there. And it's on Leiberg's list. And he recognized it as a special thing that should be taken care of. And then I think my favorite of his photographs is this is Nez Perce Pass. He sees a late summer encampment of 3 different language families, Shoshone, Bitterroot, Salish, and Nez Perce, which is completely astonishing for those who don't pay attention to tribal politics, that think tribal people are restricted to their reservations and are always at war with each other. This is a in common camp. They're up there to gather, they're up there to do a lot of things, but gather medicinal plants is part of it, those alpine plants, like Canby's lovage and juniper berries, things like that you're going to use for your winter medicine. He's up there, they're up there getting them, and Leiberg goes in and talks to them and trades with a Bitterroot Salish elder for some medicines that he sends back to the Smithsonian that, for all I know, are laying around there, kicking around there at some point. So he's really much more than a timber surveyor for the forest reserves at this point. And the USGS is very pleased with his work because not only can he do a good survey, he can write a report and get it out in time, which some people can't do. He's good in the field and he's good in the office. So over the next decade, he surveys no less than what is now about 30 national forests. It's 13 of these different reserves, and everything in Idaho from the Salmon River up to the Canadian border was done by him. But he also did stuff in Yellowstone, the Big Belts, and he did the Siskiyous. He did the ones around Los Angeles, and they eventually sent him to the San Francisco Mountains, which is an indicator of how much they valued him, because the San Franciscos are the mecca for the beginning of the environmental movement. I mean, it's where Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir and Gifford Pinchot, all these people went to meet there to think about how we should manage our forests. The first ranger there was Aldo Leopold, but it's Leiberg who did the forest survey for the San Franciscos. And again, all these reports are online. You can just Google them under the USGS annual reports. And they're so far-sighted in the way that he's trying to think about time and how things are going to change over time and what it's going to look like. So he publishes these reports, which are extensive, but he also publishes magazine articles. Here's one in National Geographic, which you can see from the board, Henry Gannett, who runs the USGS, and Sehart Merriam, who's the US biologist at that time, and our friends of Leiberg from him being back there. This is an article about climate change in National Geographic in 1899. So it explodes a lot of the ideas that we have that, again, there was this beautiful primordial forest until we started messing it up, and everything was fine until we started changing the climate with cars. I mean, he's painting a very different picture. And he's seeing into deep time in really interesting ways that, again, reflect on everything that we're talking about. His main message is that the tribes certainly used fire. There's certainly natural fires. There's certainly regimes for each kind of slope and exposure and place and latitude. But that as soon as the Mullen Road was built through Idaho in the 1850s, everything started speeding up. And if you go to sawmills, which Leiberg did, and just count rings and look for fire scars, you can see the rate of speeding up. And the railroad, the Northern Pacific, for him, the Northern Pacific was like the internet for us. As soon as the Northern Pacific went through, everything starts going so fast that you just can't keep up with it. And it's very difficult to tell how we can survive for much longer, because we can't continue to destroy things at this rate. He's very, I really believe there's a lot to learn from looking at his writings and his reports and his plant lists as they relate to where we are now and where we think we're going to be in another 100 or 200 or 400 years. Now, Carrie is the same way. Carrie is dealing with all these issues, and Idaho, as you all know, by chance, passed suffrage much earlier than any of the other Western states did, except for Wyoming. And she actually, a woman was elected to be the state representative from the Rathdrum district in the election of 1898. That's the first year that women could be in the Idaho legislature, and 3 of them got elected. The one that was from Rathdrum was this very amazing, very young woman who got a coalition together in very discordant times. There's 5 political parties in Idaho. They're all fussing with each other. Nobody agrees. And she put a coalition together and passed an anti-gambling act, which was a huge woman's issue at that time, because the men were gambling their paycheck away, and the money was needed at home. It was hygiene, gambling, and liquor those were serious women's issues. That was what Carrie's dealing with as a doctor. So she certainly agrees with those. She's certainly trying to improve all those situations, because they were what was killing her patients. And at that time, being a legislator was just, you didn't do it as a career. And so the young woman from Rathdrum didn't run again after her 2 years were up. And somehow they talked Carrie, who was actually kind of a retiring person, I think, into running in 1900 for Idaho State Rep. And the politics had completely shifted. There was a backlash against women representatives, and she lost. But there's other things going on. I mean, it's a really interesting run that year. There's a lot of mining and politics involved, but that was what Carrie was doing while John's doing these surveys. And so their life takes all these twists and turns. Again, Bernard has this very amazing life that is tied up with Carrie's. She dies in the 20s. In the 30s. He lives to the 1950s. So it comes right up to our time. And it's very hard to find out anything about her, because she never worked for the USGS or the USDA or published anything. She publishes some medical journal articles about her cases that are, again, very harrowing reading, but amazing. But she doesn't have personal details in them. And then while I was working on this book, I published a couple of articles about her, and I got, through the wonders of the internet, which is, busy destroying the world, she appeared in the life of this woman from San Diego who wrote me an email saying, I think you might be interested in this. I was at a yard sale. My mother was at a yard sale, and she picked up this Cyclopedia of Practical Medicine from 1899, which again, Carrie probably would have had. This is the Sage's. This is a fairly standard medical encyclopedia. It has Carrie Leiberg's signature on the inside cover. And, she must have owned it. And so I'm scratching my head going, that's interesting. So I get one of these and look up, what do you do with diphtheria? Bernard had diphtheria at one point in his life. How did you treat scarlet fever? What do you do with an ectopic pregnancy? All these different things are in there, and how she would have treated them. And it's an amazing book. But that's not nearly so amazing as the fact that inside this book, there's a pressed plant, because plants are what is driving this whole Leiberg story to me. And the pressed plant is a ginkgo tree, which is where John started, and I guess where Carrie might have started too. So I don't know what to say about any of this, but I just feel like there's really a lot that John Leiberg especially is trying to tell us, and there's really a lot of Carrie's story that we have not heard yet that may or may not be out there in family. We've met some descendants, have some oral information about her from one 99-year-old great niece who was very sharp and very amazing. Made Carrie sound like an unbelievable person, but she didn't know her during the homestead in Idaho days. Carrie ended up in Oakland living in a big fancy house that is still there on the historic register because she was really smart with money, unlike John, and did well for herself. So again, I feel like this is a story, it just goes all over the place, and I don't know how to ground it except with ginkgo leaves. So that works for me. So here's the cover of the book that I wrote about her. You can find that on my website or Amazon or any bookstore has it. It's easy to get. But I just want to thank Idaho and the Idaho plant community for being such a part of this Leiberg story. And a lot of what I have learned about plants, a lot of what I applied to John Leiberg's story comes from dealing with people in the Idaho Native Plant Society, and I love them for it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack, so much. Oh my goodness. You're such an amazing storyteller and writer.